Ma'am, step back. This door isn't for you. Brett's arm blocked the cockpit entrance. I held up my crew badge. He didn't even look at it. The jet bridge went quiet. Passengers slowed, watching a captain in full uniform get treated like a stowaway at her own door. I'm the captain of this flight, I said. He laughed once, short, and reached for his radio instead of my ID. A flight attendant froze mid-step, unsure whether to defend me or stay silent. I recognized that hesitation. I'd seen it before. I didn't raise my voice. I set my flight bag down slowly, the way you set down something you won't need to pick up quickly. Call whoever you need, I said, but you're delaying a flight with 68 passengers who deserve better than this. He keyed his radio anyway, calling for airport security, describing me to dispatch as someone claiming to be flight crew. A passenger near the jet bridge lifted her phone, filming quietly, not looking away from Brett's raised voice. My phone buzzed once in my blazer pocket, a message I'd been expecting all morning from a number few people had. I didn't check it yet. 10 minutes. That's all the message said the clock would need once it started. Security arrived first, 2 officers, unhurried, treating the situation like routine instead of what it actually was. She doesn't match the manifest photo, Brett told them, though he had never once looked at the manifest. I held my credentials steady in front of the nearest officer. He scanned them. The screen turned green immediately. Brett didn't accept it. Systems get spoofed, he said, loud enough for the whole boarding area to hear. A young gate agent standing near the counter went pale. She knew exactly whose name was on that manifest. She tried to speak. Brett cut her off before she got past the first word, waving her back to her post. I glanced at my watch. 6 minutes left, though nobody standing in that jet bridge understood there was a clock at all. My phone buzzed again. This time I read it. For words, from a name that changed everything about to happen. I put the phone away and looked at Brett with the same steady calm I'd carried since the first insult. You have no idea, I said quietly, what you just started. Then the jet bridge doors opened again, this time for someone else. 6 weeks before that morning, I sat in a glass-walled conference room across from the airline's board chair. A woman named Diane Ferris who had called me personally instead of routing the request through legal. She'd read the same complaints I eventually would, a dozen of them, filed over 18 months by flight attendants, gate agents, and one first officer, all describing the same station, the same pattern, crew of color treated as suspects instead of professionals the moment they stepped off a routine flight. We need someone who can fly the route and see it firsthand, Diane said. Someone with the standing to make it stick when we act. I had 22 years in the cockpit by then. I'd flown through storms that grounded lesser pilots and sat through boardrooms where I was the only black woman in the room more times than I could count. I knew exactly what seeing it firsthand would cost me personally. I said yes anyway, because I'd been on the other side of exactly this kind of dismissal once, a long time ago, as a 19-year-old flight school cadet told by an instructor that she didn't look like pilot material. I didn't tell anyone at the station who I really was beyond my crew credentials. That was the whole point. If the pattern in those complaints was real, it would show itself to an ordinary captain walking through an ordinary jet bridge on an ordinary Tuesday. It wouldn't need to be provoked. It would just need a witness with the authority to document it properly, time-stamped, corroborated, undeniable. I kept a small recorder clipped inside my flight bag from the first day of the audit. Legal had approved it under the state's one-party consent law before I ever boarded a single flight. Every station I flew through, I logged what I saw. The small things, the tone shifts, the way some staff checked credentials twice for some crew and not at all for others. This station had already given me 2 entries in that log before Brett Callahan ever put his arm across a cockpit door. What none of them knew, standing in that jet bridge watching a supervisor question a captain's very right to fly her own aircraft, was that the report sitting in my bag was already 90% finished. Brett wasn't creating a new problem. He was handing me, in real time, on video, in front of witnesses, the final page. I had flown into this particular station 4 times over 6 weeks, always on a different tail number, always in the same uniform, never announcing anything beyond what my badge already said. 3 of those 4 times, nothing happened worth logging. A quiet gate agent, a courteous ramp crew, nothing to report. That was important too. The audit wasn't built to find villains everywhere. It was built to find out whether this station in particular had a pattern, and if so, how deep it ran. The 4th time was this one. I'd requested this exact route deliberately, after Diane forwarded me an internal memo showing 3 more informal complaints filed against the same supervisor in the past year alone. All from crew of color, all closed without action, all noted in the file as resolved, no further incident. Despite the fact that none of the complainants had ever been contacted for a follow-up interview. Brett Callahan's name appeared in that memo before I ever learned his face. I remember sitting in the crew van on the way to the terminal that morning, running through what I already knew. 19 years with the airline, 2 prior HR notes about communication style that had never resulted in any formal review, a station manager who described him in an internal email as old school, but he gets results. I thought about what gets results usually meant, dressed up in language soft enough to survive an audit. I walked into that terminal the same way I always did, flight bag over my shoulder, cap tucked under my arm until I reached the gate, credentials in the outer pocket where they belonged. I wasn't looking for a confrontation. I never had been, in 6 weeks of quiet flying. I was looking for the truth of how this station actually operated when it believed no one with real authority was watching. By the time Brett's arm came up across that cockpit door, I already understood, with a kind of tired clarity, exactly what was about to happen. Not because I could predict him specifically, because the pattern had already predicted him for me. 3 complaints and 1 dismissive supervisor's note at a time. I set my bag down. I let him talk. And somewhere behind my calm face, the last page of a very long report started writing itself in real time. Back at the gate, the second security officer finally spoke directly to me instead of about me. "Ma'am, do you have anything beyond the badge? A photo ID, maybe?" I handed him my FAA airman certificate along with my driver's license, both already in hand from the moment this started. He checked them against the badge scan, checked the badge scan against the flight manifest on his own device, and nodded slowly. The kind of nod that comes when every piece of evidence in front of you agrees, and you're still bracing for someone to tell you it doesn't matter. "She's cleared," he said to his partner. Then, to Brett, "Sir, this all checks out." Brett's jaw tightened. "Then why wasn't this in the system when I asked earlier?" "It was," the officer said. "You just didn't ask." A ripple moved through the small crowd that had gathered along the boarding area. Not loud, not dramatic, just the collective shift of people recalibrating what they'd assumed they were watching. The passenger who'd been filming lowered her phone slightly, though she kept recording. I noticed her do it. I made a mental note to thank her later, quietly, the way you thank someone who does the right thing without being asked to. Brett didn't back down entirely. That never happens all at once. "I still don't think this is standard procedure," he said, mostly to the officers now, his voice smaller than it had been 5 minutes earlier. "It is," the first officer said. "It's the only procedure. You just chose to skip it." I didn't say anything. I'd learned a long time ago that the moment a room starts correcting itself, the best thing a person in my position can do is let it keep going. I picked my flight bag back up off the floor, slung it over my shoulder, and reached for my cap. 6 minutes had passed since the message came through. 4 were left. Nobody around me knew that yet. But somewhere above that jet bridge, in an office 3 floors up in the airport's administrative wing, a call was already being patched through, one that would reach this exact gate before those 4 minutes ran out. What I hadn't told anyone in that jet bridge was where the message on my phone had actually come from. It wasn't Diane. It was my compliance liaison, a quiet, precise man named Arthur Fong who'd spent the last 6 weeks turning my field notes into a formal report headed for both the airline's board and, separately, a regional FAA safety office that had opened its own inquiry after two of the station's prior complaints referenced a maintenance sign-off irregularity buried inside an otherwise unrelated HR file. That detail mattered more than anyone standing at that gate understood. Complaints about how people were treated rarely traveled alone. Where there was a pattern of dismissiveness toward crew credentials, Arthur's early findings suggested there was often a parallel pattern of skipped verification elsewhere too. A rushed pre-flight check here, a signature that should have required a second set of eyes there. Nothing catastrophic on its own, but airlines aren't grounded for one skipped signature. They're grounded when an inspector finds out how many times that shortcut has quietly repeated. Arthur's message to me that morning had read, "Board notified. FAA Regional Office pulling this station's compliance file today. Confirm status." I typed back 3 words. "In progress. Handle it." By the time Brett Callahan waved that first officer away from speaking up, the wheels Arthur had already set in motion 4 days earlier were simply catching up to the moment happening in front of me. I hadn't triggered anything new that morning. I'd simply become, without asking to, the final piece of evidence in a file that had already been building itself for weeks. The on-camera, real-time example of exactly the pattern the complaints described. I didn't feel triumphant about that. I felt tired, in the particular way that comes from being right about something you desperately wished you weren't. I thought briefly about the 19-year-old cadet I'd once been, standing in a hangar being told she didn't look the part, and about how many versions of that same sentence, spoken in different words, different uniforms, different decades, had led directly to this jet bridge. For minutes left, I adjusted my cap under my arm and waited for the doors at the end of the corridor to open. The young gate agent's name was Priya Malhotra, though I wouldn't learn that until later, in a much quieter conversation than the one happening around us now. She'd been at this station for 11 months, long enough to have seen this exact scene play out twice before with 2 different captains, both black, both eventually cleared, both never given so much as an apology once the crowd dispersed and the flight boarded. She hadn't said anything either of those times. She told me afterward that she'd convinced herself it wasn't her place, that reporting a supervisor 19 years her senior would end her career before it started, that maybe she'd misread what she'd seen both times, even though some quiet part of her knew she hadn't. Standing at her counter now, watching a third captain go through the same ID and radio ritual, something in her finally cracked open. Not loudly. She didn't storm forward or raise her voice. She simply reached under her counter, pulled out a small notebook she kept for shift notes, and wrote down the time, the flight number, and 4 words, same as before. Again, she didn't know yet that her simple, private act of documentation would become one of the most important pieces of corroborating evidence in the entire case. Proof, in her own handwriting, dated and time-stamped, that this wasn't an isolated misunderstanding, but a pattern she'd personally watched repeat. She glanced up once, toward me, and for half a second our eyes met. I didn't know her story yet. I only knew, in the particular way you learn to read a room after enough years of being underestimated in one, that she was the kind of witness who mattered, not because she was loud, but because she was honest, even when honesty cost her something she couldn't yet name. I gave her a small nod. She didn't nod back, not exactly. She just closed the notebook, slipped it back under the counter, and went back to pretending she hadn't written anything at all. 3 minutes left. Brett wasn't finished, even with the officers standing between us. Some people can't let a losing position go quietly. They have to say one more thing, as if the right sentence might still rescue the version of events they'd already decided was true before I ever reached the gate. "Look," he said, loud enough again for the row of waiting passengers to hear clearly. "I've worked this station for 19 years. I know how these situations usually go. People show up, throw around a title, expect everyone to just fall in line. Nobody threw around anything," I said. "I showed you a valid badge and a certificate. You called security instead of reading either. You people always have an excuse ready," he said. The words landed the way they always do, flat, offhand. said with the particular carelessness of someone who's used that exact sentence, or one shaped just like it, more times than he could count and never once faced a consequence for it. I didn't respond right away. I let it sit in the air, the way certain sentences deserve to sit, because I wanted it clearly heard, clearly understood, by everyone standing close enough to hear it the first time. The passenger with her phone raised it slightly higher. Priya, behind her counter, looked up sharply, notebook already back in her hand. One of the security officers actually turned his head toward Brett, the kind of look that said, quietly but unmistakably, that he'd just heard something that changed the shape of his own report. "Say that again," I said. Not a threat, just a request, calm enough that he might not have understood yet what he was walking into by answering it. He didn't repeat it. For the first time since this started, Brett hesitated. It didn't matter. The sentence had already been said once, clearly, on camera, in front of witnesses. Some doors only need to open once. 2 minutes left, and somewhere down the concourse, I heard the first sound of several people walking together, fast, with purpose. The sound grew louder before anyone else seemed to notice it. Footsteps, several sets, moving with a rhythm too deliberate for an ordinary morning rush. I recognized the pace immediately. Arthur didn't walk fast when he was calm. He walked fast when a timeline mattered. 3 figures came around the corner from the main concourse. Arthur phone first, tablet already in hand. Behind him, a woman I recognized from a single video call weeks earlier, Renee Alvarez, the airline's vice president of flight operations, and a third person I hadn't met yet, a man in a plain gray suit whose badge, even from a distance, read FA in bold blue letters. Brett saw them before Priya did. I watched his face change in real time. The particular shift that happens when someone realizes, all at once, that the story they've been telling themselves for the last 10 minutes has just run out of road. "Mr. Callahan," Renee said, stopping a few feet away, her eyes moving briefly to me, then back to him. "We need to talk. Now. Is there a problem?" Brett asked, though his voice had lost most of the certainty it carried 5 minutes earlier. The FAA inspector spoke next, calm, procedural, devastating in its plainness. "We're conducting a compliance review of this station, effective this morning. This incident is now part of that review." The crowd that had gathered along the gate went very still. I watched Priya's hand tighten slightly around the edge of her counter. I watched the passenger with the phone lower it slowly, as if some instinct told her the most important part of what she'd filmed had already happened, and what came next deserved to be witnessed with her own eyes instead of a screen. "Captain Kane," Renee said, turning fully toward me now, and for the first time all morning, someone said my rank and my name together, plainly, without doubt in their voice. "I'm sorry it took this long. It won't happen again. Not here, and not on your watch either." Brett's mouth opened. Nothing came out. 1 minute left, and it was already, unmistakably, no longer his to control. Renee didn't raise her voice, but she didn't need to. Authority rarely needs volume when it's finally standing exactly where it should have been from the start. "For the record," she said, loud enough for everyone near the gate to hear clearly. "Captain Kane has flown for this airline for 22 years. She holds a valid FAA Airman Certificate, a valid company ID, and full authorization for this flight. Every credential she presented to you this morning was verified and accurate before you ever picked up your radio." Brett opened his mouth again. "I was following station protocol." "There is no station protocol," the FAA inspector said, "that requires a supervisor to detain a verified flight crew member after credentials have already cleared. What there is a documented pattern at this station of exactly this kind of detainment, disproportionately affecting crew of color, going back at least 14 months. The words landed across the gate area like something physical. I watched Priya's shoulders drop, not in relief exactly, but in the particular release that comes when a truth you've carried quietly for a long time is finally spoken by someone with the power to act on it. 14 months, Brett repeated, quieter now, almost to himself, as if hearing the number out loud made it real in a way that abstract complaints never had. "Your file, Renee said. Your HR notes, your prior incident reports, we've had them for 3 weeks. This morning simply confirmed what we already suspected. I said nothing through any of it. I didn't need to. I'd said everything I needed to say in the first 60 seconds of this encounter, and everything since had simply been the world catching up to a fact I'd already known. That patterns don't stay hidden forever, not when enough people finally start writing them down instead of looking away. Brett's face had gone the particular shade of pale that comes right before a person understands, fully and completely, exactly how much they're about to lose. 0 minutes left. The clock I'd been quietly watching all morning had finally run out. Not for me. For him. The FAA inspector, whose name I finally learned was Daniel Osei, turned his tablet slightly so Renee could see the screen, though by then half the gate area could see it too. 14 months of station-level compliance gaps, he said. Skipped credential verifications. 2 maintenance sign-offs that don't match the actual inspection timestamps. And now, this morning, a documented pattern of discriminatory detainment on video, with a corroborating written log from station staff. You've been building a case against this station for weeks, Brett said, looking at me now, understanding arriving late and all at once. You're not just a captain. I am a captain, I said. That was never a lie. It's just not the only thing I am. Renee stepped in before he could say anything else. Captain Kane was brought on 6 weeks ago to conduct an authorized field review of this exact station, following complaints this airline should have acted on 18 months earlier. What she documented today, along with what Inspector Osei's office already found independently, is enough to require immediate action. What kind of action? Brett asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. Effective immediately, Osei said, this station's flight operations are suspended pending a full compliance audit. Every departure scheduled through this gate for the next 72 hours is grounded until we've verified crew procedures, maintenance sign-offs, and staff conduct across the board. A murmur moved through the waiting passengers. Not panic, just the low hum of people absorbing something larger than themselves. I watched Priya set down whatever she'd been holding entirely, both hands flat on the counter, as if she needed something solid to hold on to while the moment settled. Brett didn't argue anymore. There was nothing left to argue against. Not credentials that had already cleared twice. Not a pattern 14 months in the making. Not a sentence he himself had said out loud, on camera, 20 minutes earlier. You made the most expensive mistake of your career, I said quietly, about 6 minutes before I ever said a word back to you. He didn't respond. There wasn't anything left for him to say. Word of the grounding order moved through the terminal faster than any announcement could have carried it. Within 20 minutes, gate agents at 3 other departure areas were quietly informed that their flights, too, were affected, not because anything had gone wrong at their specific counters, but because the compliance hold applied to the entire station's operations until Inspector Osei's team completed its review. I watched it ripple outward from where I stood. A supervisor 2 gates down taking a call and going quiet mid-sentence. A maintenance crew being redirected off the tarmac. An overhead announcement, calm and procedural, informing passengers of a temporary operational pause affecting this concourse, carefully worded to explain everything and nothing at once. Brett was escorted away by 2 of his own station's security staff, not in handcuffs, not dramatically, just quietly. The way people are removed from a workplace once every possible justification for keeping them there has been exhausted. He didn't look back at me. I didn't expect him to. Renee stayed a few minutes longer, speaking quietly with Priya, thanking her directly for the notebook entries that would later become part of the formal record. I watched Priya's composure finally crack, just slightly, not from fear this time, but from the simple relief of being taken seriously after 11 months of assuming she wouldn't be. Inspector Osei approached me last. We'll need your full field report by end of day, he said. But this, he gestured toward the now empty space where Brett had been standing. This was the piece that made everything else undeniable. 18 months of paperwork, and it took 11 minutes of him talking to make the case airtight. I didn't feel the satisfaction people might expect. I felt something quieter, the particular stillness that comes after a long, careful process finally closes, not because I'd wanted to win an argument, but because a pattern that had hurt real people for over a year had finally been named clearly enough that it couldn't be ignored again. I need to fly this aircraft, I said. 68 people are still waiting. Jose nodded. The flight's cleared. You were never the problem. I picked my bag back up and finally walked through the cockpit door that had been blocked from me less than half an hour earlier. The internal investigation moved faster than most people at the station expected, though I'd seen enough of these processes by then to know that speed usually meant the evidence had left no real room for delay. Within 72 hours, the Compliance Review Inspector Jose's office conducted alongside the airline's own legal team confirmed what the video, Priya's notebook, and my own field report had already made clear. This wasn't a single supervisor's bad morning. It was a documented pattern, spanning 14 months, that station leadership had repeatedly closed out as resolved, without ever actually resolving anything. Brett Callahan was terminated within the week, not only for the incident at the gate, but for a documented history of similar detainments that had simply never been escalated properly. 2 other supervisors at the same station were placed on administrative leave pending further review, after the audit revealed they'd signed off on internal reports describing prior incidents as isolated, despite clear records showing otherwise. The station manager who'd once described Brett as old school, but he gets results, was also named in the compliance report, not for direct discrimination, but for what the final findings called a pattern of institutional avoidance, the quiet, bureaucratic choice to look away rather than address something uncomfortable directly. The grounding order itself lasted just under 72 hours, long enough for the FAA to complete an emergency review of the station's maintenance sign-off procedures, which turned out to have their own irregularities entirely separate from Brett's conduct. The kind of shortcuts that rarely make headlines until they cause something far worse than a delayed flight. None of that would have surfaced, Inspector Jose told me later, without the incident at my gate forcing a formal review that had otherwise been quietly stalled in an internal queue for months. I didn't take any particular pride in being the reason it moved. I understood, plainly, that pride wasn't really the point. The point was that 18 months of complaints from people with far less standing than mine had finally been heard, not because they'd been louder, but because the system had finally been forced to look. Priya Malhotra was formally recognized in the final compliance report as a corroborating witness, her time-stamped notebook entries cited by name as one of the pieces of evidence that established the pattern beyond dispute. Under the airline's whistleblower protections, newly reinforced after the review, her position was made permanent with a formal commendation added to her file, the opposite of the quiet punishment she'd feared for 11 months every time she'd almost spoken up and hadn't. I met her once more before I flew out of that station for the last time on this particular assignment. She found me near the gate, notebook nowhere in sight this time, and asked, a little hesitantly, whether I'd known from the beginning that people like her would matter to the outcome. I didn't know you specifically, I told her, but I always assume someone is watching who cares more than they're given credit for. Usually I'm right. She didn't say much after that. She didn't need to. Some conversations are complete in far fewer words than people expect. The passenger who'd filmed the confrontation reached out separately through the airline's public relations office, offering her footage voluntarily once she learned an investigation was underway. Her name was Denise Ortiz, a marketing consultant flying home from a conference, someone who told investigators she'd filmed simply because it didn't look right, and I figured someone should have proof either way. Her video was entered into the record alongside Priya's notes and my own report, 3 independent sources converging on the same 11 minutes. The airline issued a public statement 2 weeks later, acknowledging the findings, outlining new mandatory bias and credential verification training across all stations, and confirming that 3 employees, including Brett Callahan, were no longer with the company. It didn't name me. I hadn't asked it to. Some parts of a story are better left in the file where they belong, doing their work quietly instead of loudly. 6 weeks after the grounding order lifted, I flew back through that same station on an ordinary rotation. No audit clipboard in my bag this time. No recorder clipped inside the lining. Just a captain reporting for a regular flight. The way I had thousands of times before that particular Tuesday morning changed the shape of everything for a while. The gate looked the same. The jet bridge hummed with the same fluorescent light. But something in the air had shifted in ways I noticed, even if no passenger walking through would have. A new supervisor greeted the crew that morning. A woman named Carla Jennings, who checked every credential the same careful way regardless of who was presenting them, glancing at IDs with the same unhurried thoroughness for a black first officer as she did for a white flight attendant standing behind him. Priya was still at her counter, notebook nowhere in sight because there was nothing left she felt she needed to secretly record. She caught my eye as I passed and gave a small, genuine smile, the kind that doesn't need explaining to anyone who was there for what came before it. I thought, walking down that jet bridge toward the cockpit door that had once been blocked from me, about how quietly most real change actually happens. Not in a single dramatic confrontation, though those moments matter more than people sometimes admit. Change happens in the small, unglamorous machinery that follows. A new supervisor trained properly, a whistleblower protected instead of punished, a pattern finally named clearly enough in a compliance file that it can't be quietly closed out as resolved ever again. I settled into my seat, ran through my pre-flight checklist the way I always had, and looked out at the tarmac stretching toward the runway. 61 passengers boarding behind me this time, none of them aware of anything that had happened here weeks earlier, which was, in its own way, exactly the point. Some victories are loud. This one had simply become invisible, the way justice sometimes looks once it's finally doing its job correctly. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a cockpit right before takeoff. Once every checklist item has been called and confirmed, once the noise of the terminal has fallen away behind the closed door. I've always loved that quiet. It's the moment a flight stops being anyone's argument and simply becomes what it was always meant to be. 60-some people trusting a small crew to get them somewhere safely, without needing to know or care about anything that happened on the ground beforehand. I thought, in that quiet, about the 19-year-old cadet I used to be, standing in a hangar being told she didn't look like pilot material, believing for one small, terrible moment that maybe the instructor was right. It took years to understand that the problem had never been what I looked like. It had only ever been what certain people expected to see, and how quickly they mistook their own expectations for fact. I thought about Priya's notebook, small and unremarkable, sitting in a drawer under a counter for 11 months before anyone gave her a reason to believe it mattered. I thought about Denise Ortiz, a stranger who filmed because something didn't look right and trusted that proof was worth having even before she knew what it would become. I thought about Brett Callahan, not with anger by that point, just with a kind of tired clarity. A man who'd built 19 years on assumptions no one had ever required him to examine, until finally, someone did. None of us had set out that morning to change how an entire station operated. I'd simply shown up to fly a route, carrying a truth about myself that I hadn't advertised and had no obligation to. The rest had unfolded the way these things usually do, once enough small, honest pieces of evidence are finally allowed to sit next to each other in the same room. I keyed the radio, requested clearance, and felt the aircraft begin to move. I don't tell this story often, and when I do, I try to tell it plainly, without dressing it up more than it deserves. It wasn't about proving a point to Brett Callahan. It was never really about him at all, not in the way it might have looked from the jet bridge that morning. It was about 18 months of people who'd been dismissed quietly, one at a time, until enough of their small, honest accounts finally sat in the same file and became impossible to explain away. I think about Priya sometimes, and the particular kind of courage it takes to write 4 words in a notebook when you're not sure yet whether anyone will ever read them. I think about how close that courage came to never being tested at all. If I'd simply stepped back that morning the way Brett expected me to, the way so many people before me apparently had. I didn't step back. Not because I was fearless. I don't think fearlessness is really what this kind of moment requires. I stayed steady because I'd learned, over 22 years and one very long 6-week audit, that patience and documentation do more lasting work than anger ever could. Anger burns bright and fades. A clear, corroborated record outlasts almost everything. The station operates differently now. I know that not because anyone told me directly, but because I've flown through it a handful of times since, and the small differences are the kind you only notice if you were paying close attention to begin with. A supervisor who checks every badge the same way, a young gate agent who no longer needs a notebook hidden under her counter, a quiet at the airport that isn't the quiet of people looking away, but the ordinary quiet of a system finally working the way it always should have. Some mornings, dignity doesn't arrive with anger or spectacle. Sometimes it just arrives on time, in a uniform, holding a badge that was valid all along, and waits, patiently, for the truth to catch up to everyone standing in the room. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next dramatic story. Tap like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching.